I remember the first time I heard the name. It slithered into conversation like a whisper behind my ear, something half-formed, something meant to stay hidden. But secrets have a way of rising no matter how deep they're buried. The apartment was a mess when they found her. Ash smeared the walls in jagged streaks, the air thick with the rancid perfume of burnt flesh and melted plastic. They said she had been a quiet woman, kept to herself, didn't make enemies. But someone had hated her enough to make sure she never spoke again. The police found her in what used to be her living room, her body charred beyond recognition, curled in on itself like a dried husk. No signs of forced entry, no signs of a struggle, nothing stolen. Just fire, cruel and deliberate, cleansing everything in its wake. Except for one thing, a pile of jewelry. Not hers, someone else's. Pieces scattered near the body as if she had clawed at them in her final moments. A desperate attempt to leave a clue in a crime that had no answers. Days turned into weeks, then months. Leads dried up. No fingerprints, no witnesses, no motive. Just another cold case, an unsolved horror left to rot in the shadows. Until she spoke again. It started at the hospital, in the quiet hum of the night shift. A nurse, one of her co-workers, began acting strangely. First, it was small things, forgetting conversations, staring too long at nothing. Then it became worse, murmured words under her breath, a language she didn't speak. And then one night, she stopped being herself altogether. She collapsed in the break room, convulsing violently before her body stilled. When she opened her mouth, it wasn't her voice that came out. It was hers. The dead woman, the one burned alive. Her voice came through hoarse, cracked from smoke that no longer existed. I know who killed me. The room froze. No one moved. No one breathed. Then she spoke a name, and the nightmare truly began. Part 2, the name of the dead. The silence after she spoke that name was unbearable. It sat in the air like a thick fee, suffocating, pressing in on everyone in that tiny fluorescent-lit break room. No one wanted to believe it. No one wanted to say it out loud. But we all heard it. The nurse, her name was Marion, snapped back to herself like waking from a nightmare. Her eyes darted around the room, pupils wide, breath coming in ragged gasps. What happened? She whispered, clutching the edge of the table as if it might anchor her back to reality. No one answered. I could still hear the voice, her voice, raspy, ashen, twisted by something beyond death itself. I know who killed me. And then the name of someone we knew. The room felt smaller, walls pushing in, the hum of the vending machine suddenly too loud. The flickering light overhead making shadows dance in ways they shouldn't. The others tried to rationalize it. It's just stress, one of the doctors muttered. She's exhausted. Maybe she heard something without realizing it. Another nurse added, though her voice wavered with uncertainty. But Marion, she looked pale, shaken, like something inside her had cracked open and wouldn't close again. I don't know why I said that, she stammered. I didn't say it. I mean, I did, but it wasn't me. I knew the feeling, that unshakable dread, like something had crept up behind us, watching, waiting. And the worst part, the name she spoke belonged to a man who worked right here, someone who walked these halls, someone who could be listening even now. I didn't want to believe it, but I couldn't ignore the way my skin crawled, the way the air in the room had changed, thick with something unseen. And then the scream came, from down the hall, high-pitched, terrified, a sound that would haunt me for the rest of my life. We ran. God help us, we ran, and what we found made me wish we hadn't. The scream echoed down the sterile white halls, twisting through the empty hospital corridors like a warning. My legs moved before my brain could catch up, every instinct screaming at me to turn back, to pretend I hadn't heard it. But some things won't let you turn away. We reached the source of the noise, a patient's room, door wide open, lights flickering erratically like something was wrong with the wiring. But we all knew that wasn't it. The moment I stepped inside, the smell hit me. Smoke. Not the faint burnt toast kind. not the sharp chemical burn of sterilized hospital equipment. This was different. This was flesh. A nurse stood frozen near the bed, her hands pressed to her mouth, fingers trembling. Her eyes were wild, pupils so large they nearly swallowed the color of her irises. She didn't speak. She just pointed. And when I followed her gaze, my stomach twisted into knots. A man was sitting upright in the hospital bed, eyes wide open, mouth locked in a silent scream. His skin was burnt, charred black and cracked, as if he had been trapped in a fire that none of us had seen. His arms were outstretched, fingers curled into claws, as if trying to reach for something. Or someone. He wasn't moving. He wasn't breathing. The room was ice cold, yet the scent of smoke clung to the air, thick and suffocating. And then I saw it. The name on his hospital ID. The same name Marion had spoken in that awful dead voice. The man she had accused, the one she had no reason to know, no way to suspect, was lying in front of us, burned alive from the inside out. Someone whimpered behind me. Marion, her face pale as a corpse. Her voice cracked. I didn't mean to. I turned to her, every nerve in my body screaming that something was horribly wrong. She wasn't looking at me. She was looking past me. I followed her gaze, and that's when I saw it. A reflection in the dark window, a figure standing behind us, watching, burning, smiling. The reflection in the window wasn't ours. It stood just behind us, twisted and wrong, flickering like the embers of a dying fire. The shape of a woman, her face half melted, her mouth stretched into something that might have once been a smile. The air turned suffocating, heavy, like the room itself had been swallowed by smoke we couldn't see. Marion let out a strangled sob and stumbled backward, her body shaking violently. No, she whispered. No, this isn't real. But it was. The burnt corpse in the bed. The smell of charred flesh. The name spoken by the dead. It was all real. And then the lights went out. The room plunged into absolute blackness. The only sound was our ragged breathing, the pounding of my heart so loud it felt like it might crack my ribs. Then movement. Something shifted in the dark. Slow. Deliberate. The whisper came next. Not in my ear. Inside my head. He screamed too. A rush of heat blistered my skin and I choked on the phantom sensation of fire licking up my arms, crawling toward my throat. I gasped, stumbling backward, but there was nowhere to go. Something was here, and it was angry. The emergency backup lights flickered on, casting the room in eerie red. My breath caught in my throat. The body in the hospital bed was gone. The sheets were still there, burned and blackened, the scent of death thick in the air. But the body, the charred, twisted corpse of the man Marion had named, had vanished. Marion was shaking, her fingers digging into her arms hard enough to draw blood. We have to leave, now! But the door was closed. I hadn't heard it shut. None of us had. And then, the doorknob began to turn, slowly. The red lights flickered, shadows twisting along the walls. The knob rattled harder, as if something was trying to get in. Or worse, trying to keep us inside. And then the whisper again, curling around me like smoke, filling my lungs with its presence. It's not over. The door flung open with a violent slam, and what stood on the other side made my blood run cold. The door swung open violently, slamming against the wall with a force that shook the room. The hallway beyond was dark, too dark. The hospital lights should have been on, but all that stretched before us was a corridor swallowed in shifting black. And standing in the doorway was him, the man who should have been dead, the man who had been burned alive. But it wasn't really him anymore. His skin was still charred, blackened, and cracked. His lips peeled away to expose a skeletal grin. His eyes, milky white, hollow, locked onto us, but they weren't seeing. They weren't human. Marion let out a strangled gasp and stumbled back, shaking her head violently. No, you're dead, you're dead. The figure took a step forward, A sickening crack echoed as the bones in his legs shifted, his body struggling to hold itself together. Ash trailed from his fingertips. The scent of burning meat filled my nose, and then, in a voice that was both his and hers, "You let me burn." The room tilted. My vision swam. Images flashed in my mind. Fire, smoke curling against the ceiling, hands reaching, grabbing, a struggle. A woman's screams, her voice raw, pleading. A shadowed figure standing over her. Not a stranger. Someone she knew, someone she trusted. Marion. The realization hit me like a knife to the gut. I turned to her, my hands trembling. "You," my voice cracked. You knew who did this." Marion was crying now, her entire body trembling. "I didn't," her breath hitched. "I didn't mean for it to happen like that." A deep, rattling breath filled the room. The burned figure was closer now. Too close. "Liar!" A burst of heat slammed into me, forcing me back. The lights flickered wildly. The walls trembled. The scent of burning flesh grew suffocating. Marion screamed. The figure lunged. And then the room erupted. Flames exploded from nowhere, curling up the walls, consuming everything in their path. The heat was unbearable, scorching my skin, my throat, my lungs. Marion was on the floor, her screams turning into choking sobs. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to." The fire didn't care. The figure reached for her. His fingers, blackened, skeletal, brushed against her skin. And then Marion burst into flames. Her shrieks echoed through the room as fire engulfed her, her body convulsing, curling in on itself like burning paper. Her flesh melted, sloughing off in wet, bubbling chunks. Her eyes, wide, filled with agony, locked onto mine. And then she was gone. Nothing left but ash. The heat vanished in an instant. The fire was gone. The room was silent. And the figure was smiling. He turned, the milky hollows of his eyes locking onto mine. And then, in a whisper that made my blood turn to ice, "She wasn't the only one who let me burn." The temperature dropped. The lights flickered once, twice, and then darkness.